Good afternoon, everybody. It is 12 o'clock right on the dot, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Julie Blanchard. I'm the Wellness Programs Manager here at Carilion, and I'm happy to see lots of familiar faces, and I also see some new faces here today. So thank you all for joining us for this very special presentation. I am happy to introduce to you Dr. Joe Geik. And when I say happy, it's because I've had the privilege of seeing this presentation, and I promise you that you're going to walk away with some real practical strategies to help you every day in your pursuit of happiness. So at this time, I will go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Geik.
Thank you, Julie. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me, Julie?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. All right. I'm going to share my screen, and I appreciate everybody for joining us today. This presentation is something that we had delivered as part of a public presentation to the community a few months back. And part of it stems, well, there's a couple of reasons why we had wanted to deliver it. First and foremost, we're trying to find ways of being able to help educate and reach more people, because as a psychologist, there just aren't enough therapists in general. You know, we've heard about sort of a mental health crisis, and not everybody needs therapy. Not everybody wants therapy. Not everybody has time for therapy. And yet at the same time, we also know that there is a range of information that is available to us out there, whether it be, self-help materials, literature, other, we live in a world where we, view shorts and clips on social media. There are podcasts specifically devoted to this, and some very good ones that I'll reference at the end of this presentation. But part of this came out of a place of wanting to try and see how we can better reach people and provide education, and in part, not just about happiness, but about cognitive behavioral therapy or therapy in general. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. So whenever I meet somebody for psychotherapy, is it not sure? Oh no, it's not moving. Okay. So whenever I meet somebody, when it comes to psychotherapy, or if I do an intake with somebody, one of the things I always ask is like, what is your goal? What would you like to see as an outcome? What would you like to see that's different from where we start to where you finish? And when people present, they're often, reporting a lot of distress, anxiety, discomfort, mood symptoms, things of that nature. The number one thing that I routinely hear from folks over and over again is this idea that what I want is to essentially be happy. Okay. Or some variation of that. I want to be more like my old self, or happy like my old self. And so this is the number one thing that folks tell me, and part of my job is to try and figure out how to turn that into some sort of functional operational outcome in the models of care that we can offer. But I also highlight this in part because it also highlights the general sort of unease, distress that sometimes a lot of people experience. And sort of like in the broader spectrum, whether it be employees in our own department, folks that are coming in to see us right now, or just communication with people in the community, there seems to be a lot of just sort of unease, distress. There's been quite a bit of that since we went through COVID a number of years back. And so part of this is like trying to figure out how to help people turn this into some sort of functional outcome. Okay, so that being said, when it comes to cognitive behavioral therapy or therapies, I wanted to introduce this too as part of the general education. So when we reached out to the community to do this presentation, one of the things that I often find is that folks, when they come to therapy, they want, therapy, counseling, ask them, what is your experience with things, prior therapy, et cetera. And sometimes they're able to talk about what they've experienced. A lot of times when I review referrals, it will have information in there, recommend CBT. People will say, well, I've heard of CBT, but I don't know what it is. If you go to any of the key, sites around, like WebMD or, Mayo and things like that, if you read through what is recommended for depression, anxiety, et cetera, one of the things that you'll come across is CBT. And so we also wanted to take this opportunity to try and let people know that CBT is a much broader umbrella than any particular type of thing. It has really grown and proliferated as a treatment for mental health conditions since I would say its origins start back in the 40s and 50s, quite honestly. And so it has grown quite a bit over time. But what I will also say is there is a tremendous amount of overlap between what we will talk about today, as far as happiness and some of these strategies, because part of what I'm hoping to be able to communicate are cognitive behavioral therapy strategies or concepts that are rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy that help us achieve better satisfaction, more joy, and just general overall happiness as a whole. So you're going to see a lot of information here, but what I would say is that I put this up here because CBT has evolved over time in the direction that allows us to have or has provided us treatment protocols for a variety of different conditions, presentations, and challenges that people experience on the mental health front. Everything from what we would think of as, common in mental health, depression, anxiety, all the way to more OCD, grief, loss, family conflict, things of that nature. So cognitive behavioral therapy is this larger umbrella. And I put this out here because while cognitive behavioral therapy has its origins going way, way back decades, we're sort of now at a place where we sort of think of ourselves as being in the third generation of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'll talk more about like what those advances are, where we are now, and how that applies to happiness here in a second. But at its core, one of the things that has evolved out of like cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapy is this idea that our outcomes are often rooted or linked between how we think, feel, and behave. And a core component of any cognitive behavioral therapy is helping us build awareness by helping us track the outcomes, events, to increase our awareness of things that we might consider unconscious, things that are sort of habitual patterns, things that we're not really aware of. And what I always tell folks is that patterns are almost this necessary evil in our world. Patterns help us get through our days, patterns help us accomplish tasks, and patterns work very, very well until they don't. And many patterns can become sort of unconscious, habitual when we think about like childhood patterns, relationship patterns, things of that nature. That's sort of the origin there. But within CBT, we have what's called, or historically called, the CBT triangle. And this is sort of the classic tried and true concept within CBT. I present this because it is something that can be applied in your day-to-day world. It can be applied with positive outcomes, not so positive outcomes. But the idea is that there is a direct behavioral, emotional, neurological relationship between how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. And all of those elements in our response pattern tend to come from some sort of activating event, a triggering event. And it doesn't have to be a significant trigger. This process is unfolding even as we're talking through this presentation today. While you're sitting there eating lunch or whatever it is that you're doing, what I would say is we're always acting and reacting and learning and appraising and evaluating what's happening both inside of us and outside of us. And if we boil that down to the core kinds of things that are in this model, when we think about thinking, cognition, one of the things that we know is that because we are language-based creatures, language is the predominant way in which we tend to make sense of our world. Language creates associations in our brain that elicit and are attached and fused with certain emotional feeling states. So in this example here, if somebody has this ongoing narrative or dialogue, and you'll hear me talk about narrative a lot, somebody says, I'm never going to be good enough, that's likely to elicit corresponding parallel feelings of frustrated, helplessness, hopelessness, sadness. And as a result of that internal state, it's likely to impact our reality through behavior, such as I might procrastinate, I might withdraw, I might lash out, I might do other things as a result of that internal feeling state. On the flip side, though, what can happen is that if I believe that I am good enough, I do a generally good job, at work or whatever it is, at home, that's likely to lead to a better sense of satisfaction, a sense of being content. And that's likely to influence my behaviors as well. And so this is kind of like this reciprocal back and forth model. And it's a simplified version of sort of what happens, assuming things are somewhat linear, but they're not. But on a linear level, this is essentially sort of the core of what CBT tries to help us identify are the patterns in these different states to help us be able to have a better fighting chance to do something different or to change our world or to change our patterns. So within this model, one of the limitations is that it is linear. Okay. But common CBT type of activities, and these are things people can do on their own. You'll find these recommended in podcasts, the things I'm talking about today. You'll hear them in self-help books, content. You'll see them on social media. Common CBT types of activities include what we call thought monitoring or restructuring, starting to pay attention to your internal dialogue, your narrative. And I refer to it as narrative because if we tell ourselves something over and over again, it tends to become the narrative by which we operate in our world. Relaxation and stress reduction techniques. You'll see these mentioned a lot in different materials, social media. And the whole idea here is what we're trying to do is we're trying to alter and shift, even in simple ways, your physiological state. So one of the basic principles of how we operate within CBT is this idea that our body has a hard time being in two physical states at the same time. It is very difficult for your bodies to be both relaxed and anxious, or to be focused and driven and sort of in like a very depressed, melancholy type of space. Okay. Those things are sort of like opposing opposite states, and your body's always in a state of trying to balance these out in some way. And so part of what CBT tries to do is encourage us to activate, to alter our physical response. And sometimes we come away with recommendations that, you should exercise like an hour a day or be active and do these things. And maybe I have time, maybe I don't necessarily have all the time to do that. Maybe that sounds like a lot, but the reality is that even more subtle ways, things we can do in our day-to-day world can help us modify and alter our physical state. So if we work in healthcare, sometimes that can be a very stressful type of situation. If we stay in a heightened state of stress throughout the day, that tends to be fatiguing, exhausting, physically, emotionally, mentally. What we do know is that if we do something to alter our physical state, just briefly, simple things like breathing, taking a moment, smiling, doing something good for somebody, some of the things I'll talk about here, it helps alter and create a dip in that response set physically through the day. It can help restore us and help us be more consistent with what we're trying to do. Behavioral activation. Behavioral activation is founded in the idea of doing things that increase joy, satisfaction, pleasure, doing things because I can, because I get something out of it. And in fact, behavioral activation is one of the primary behavioral recommendations for just chronic low, what we call anhedonic depression, where I just feel blah all the time. And the idea is sometimes there is an element of faking it till you make it in this, but the idea is that as we introduce ourselves to pleasurable outcomes or things that can be pleasurable, even if I don't perceive it right away, it increases the chance that I start to experience more satisfaction. It is also grounded in what we call conditioning strategies. Okay, looking at again, we go back to the patterns and how we think and how we respond and behave. There's a heavy element of CBT that's based in conditioning. So this is largely the academic overview of this concept, but I introduce this because the thing about therapy, and sometimes what people don't necessarily anticipate, is that CBT, one, I encourage people to ask for it. I encourage them to ask for a derivative of CBT if they seek therapy from your therapist, but also understanding that it's an active process. It's not a passive process. And that becomes important in how it separates itself from sort of what would more passive types of counseling services and things of that nature. Okay. It's about trying to help us identify the patterns and make change. Now, following along this, when we talk about internal dialogue and narrative, those thought patterns and so forth, things that we tend to do, especially under stress, is we tend to engage a lot of what we call thought errors or unhelpful patterns in thinking or stuck points. There's different ways of thinking about this. And this is a lot of information on the slide. But the idea here is that we all have tendencies and defaults in our thinking, response patterns that tend to bring us to a place where we tend to personalize on some level. And these things become much more prominent when we are under stress or distress. Our brain is wired that when we are uncomfortable, it goes to what is simplest and easiest, basically. And the idea here is that these are some of them, not all of them. There are different types of thought errors that tend to magnify and intensify the distress that we might experience. And so when we talk about being aware of patterns in our thinking, patterns in our response, part of this is being able to map out and notice what some of my tendencies might be. So one of the more common ones is like this idea of all or none thinking. The idea that things have to be black or white. And by the way, our mind is designed to try and create these polarized outcomes. It's either good or bad, black or white, pass, fail. Our brain is designed to not think in complex terms. It wants to simplify things, yet at the same time, that can magnify the distress that I experience if I get stuck there. And the idea with CBT is to try and bring balance to understanding both sides of those coins. So for example, if somebody believes that, I'm a failure or things have to be perfect, that adds a lot of pressure. Psychologically, physically, neurologically, it adds a lot of pressure. The idea with CBT is being able to balance it and understand that not everything is a failure, because failure is absolute, and sort of backing off a little bit, which should help lessen and soften some of what I feel. There are a number of here, I'm not going to go through them all. Well, one of the, when we talk about things today, one of the big ones is this idea of emotional reasoning. The idea that how things are, or that what I experience in life must be true because of how I feel. So a lot of times emotions are important for us to learn and get through things, and they enhance our ability to learn. At the same time, they can definitely bias how we respond. One of the ones that people often talk about is like shoulding and restrictive thinking. Sometimes people rephrase it as like, don't should all over yourself kind of thing. But the idea is when we add shoulds and musts and have tos, it increases pressure. It locks us into binary, absolute pass-fail types of outcomes. They can increase what I experience. The minute somebody says, I can't, they've locked themselves into a limited set of options. They've eliminated other options. And it becomes almost this block. And when we talk about narratives, the more somebody tells themselves, I can't, or I should, it tends to increase pressure. And pressure, avoidance-based pressure, emotional-based pressure of avoidance tends to become a real block to actually initiating and engaging activities. It's a hard thing to overcome. It becomes almost like a real physical block. Sometimes we'll find folks that maybe engage in what we call wishful thinking. I'll talk a little bit more about this as well when we talk about strategies, because wishfulness, I'm not saying don't be hopeful, perfectly good to be hopeful. Wishfulness, if we wish and wish and wish and wish and nothing ever happens, it tends to lead to a sense of helplessness. And helplessness leads to sort of apathy and pulling back. So I put this out here because this is, again, sort of like old school, tried and true CBT. And the idea is that if people want, paying attention to thought patterns and how response patterns and what I tell myself internally, consistently on a day-to-day basis, or in particular under stress, this can be helpful because part of it is being able to balance our response as part of the intervention. All right. So cognitive behavioral therapy has definitely gone in more advanced directions, in different directions, in a more scientific grounded and medically grounded direction over time. And that becomes important for our conversation today because we're trying to get away from some of the linear nature of old models, but current directions in CBT do a much better job of understanding how our internal physical states and emotions and feeling states interplay, affect one another, and affect outcomes. There is an improved understanding for how our motor centers, how linguistics and language, and sensory processing impact thinking and behavior. And those things have become much more embedded into how we approach moods, anxiety, stress, things of that nature. To that point, there has been a lot of movement in the direction of incorporating mindfulness and meditation practices into CBT. Some of what we call third generation CBTs, one of which is what's called mindfulness-based CBT. Another one is called acceptance and commitment therapy. These are third generation CBT interventions, incorporate a heavy dose of being present centered, heavy dose of mindfulness-based practices. And there's a real neurological reason we do this. And I'll talk about that as part of what we do today. There is less information in newer models about changing the way you think. So sometimes people will tell me that CBT is about changing your way of thinking. You're supposed to think happy. It's less about changing the way you think and more about increasing our ability to accept and balance, have acceptance in our world, and have more balance in our perspective. So we're going to move away from this because you're probably saying, okay, that's a lot of information about CBT. What about this idea of CBT and happiness? So we're going to transition here. And when we talk about CBT and happiness, the first thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about myths around happiness in particular. Okay? First and foremost, if I go back to what people talk to me about when they come for an intake, they say that they want to be happy. Okay. The reality is, number one, happiness is not a permanent physical emotional state. We sometimes think of it as this direct outcome that I want to accomplish, but happiness by its nature is not permanent. Happiness as an emotion is not permanent. It actually requires a heavy amount of energy, cognitive resource consumption for your body to sustain it. And that's just not possible. Okay. And so when we come back to the idea of maybe happiness is less about the destination and more about the journey, the idea here is trying to move us away from happiness as this fixed outcome, that I will be happy or I will be unhappy. Okay. There's actually a book that I recommend at the end, what's called The Happiness Trap. And the idea is that we are constantly told or have developed this narrative and expectation that we're supposed to be happy. And the reality is not everything is joyful, not everything is happy. Life has a mix of experiences. And what we tend to find is that when people are heavily focused on happiness as a sole outcome, they actually have a harder time achieving it. It's kind of like a paradox. The second thing that you often might hear is that maybe happiness is tied to money, those kinds of things. And there is actual research on this. One of the more recent ones was a 2018 study. Again, this is pre-COVID. But what they found is that general satisfaction and happiness cap out at about $95,000 a year. And it's not to say that there aren't real life distresses and things that come with finances and resource and having access to resource. Those things notwithstanding, what we find is that it caps. And if we control for inflation, where we are now, that caps out about $120,000, give or take. Okay. And what we find is that the effort to get more happiness based on money alone doesn't work out beyond that ceiling. Okay. There are a variety of reasons why we think that is the case. But I'll come back to this other idea too, that there is one exception. You might be thinking of this, but there is one exception to where money can bring more happiness and more satisfaction. And I'll talk about that later. I'll come back to that point. Myth 3, maybe more happiness is better. And again, that's just harder. Sometimes this hedonistic, hedonic principle like plays out there. I need more. And the reality is it's just not sustainable. It actually leads to more dissatisfaction if we're pursuing and pursuing and pursuing. Myth 4, happy people are just born that way, which is not necessarily the case. That there is a genetic and there is a biological component to this. And actually, Sonia Lyubomirsky, who's a professor of psychology and has written different books on happiness and the myths of happiness, which I highly recommend, describes what is sort of largely known as the happiness pie. And within that pie, roughly 40 to 50% of happiness has to do with genetics. Another 30, 40-ish percent has to do with our current activities, with the things that we do or the things that we don't do, okay, which contribute to that. And then 10%-ish has to do with current life circumstance, because the reality is that life does have ups and downs, and that can definitely influence where we are as far as our satisfaction. And so you may hear me reference this happiness pie, but the idea here is that it's not that people are just born that way. there are things that we can do that facilitate or things that we can do that sort of get in the way. Myth number 5 that you might often hear is that if I could blank, fill in the blank, whatever it is, I would be happy. And this gets into the idea of wishfulness here, okay? And what we actually find is that the more we wish and wish and wish, we're actually setting up a trap. And if then statements, cognitively, this is a psychologist to me, if then statements sometimes create traps that bind us and limit us. So if I constantly say, if only I could have, this job, or if I could have this family or this spouse, or if only my kids were this way, then I would be happy. We're setting up contingencies that actually take away from our ability to enjoy the present. Going back to what some of the current CBT focuses have us do. And then finally, one of the other myths that we often hear or find is that happiness should just happen. There's almost this expectation that it's supposed to just happen this way. And what we find, especially with myth number 5, myth number 6, and myth number 3, as well as 1, is that sometimes the more we value, and I go back to this, and value happiness as a sole outcome, as a deliverable, as an end state, the more unhappy people tend to be. And this has been documented in research. There was a 2011 study that sort of talks about this as the paradox of happiness, or the happiness mind. And the idea is that what we find is that the more people value it, the more unsatisfied they are that they can't get there. And so this brings us back to the idea of trying to help us be focused more on the process of getting there and the journey of getting there than just being there, because it's not sustainable. All right, so what about this journey? Okay. So this is where I wanted to talk about legitimate, practical kinds of things. We've talked a little bit about CBT as a whole. If people want to learn more, you're more than welcome to reach out to me, email me, let me know. Happy to point you in the direction of some resources or just conversation about it. One of the things, in addition to being aware of our patterns, it's like once we know the patterns, what do we do? How do we install these kinds of things that might be facilitative to me feeling better or just having more satisfaction in our world? And so it brings us back to this journey. And the thing about the journey, any type of journey is a metaphor, is that journeys require effort. They are not necessarily passive. They're not absent in the sense that we just go through them and things just happen. The thing about a journey is we have to figure it out, we have to apply effort, and we have to do things along the way. There is some effort required. And that's the thing about happiness. There is some effort required. One of the most unique, not unique, but kind of unique kinds of and simple ways of introducing satisfaction into our world, this is a very practical thing, is this idea of savoring. And this is a term that you might see, in different social media platforms and clips. But the idea of savoring, and savoring has to do with how being more experientially focused, living more in the moment, and enjoying what is actually happening to us. That could be at home, that could be at work. And I put up this picture of these cookies, and I have no doubt, as it's happening to me as I look at these cookies and think about savoring, I have no doubt that some of you are thinking about cookies and salivate and wanting a cookie after this. Maybe some of you can even smell them or taste them. And when we've done this presentation before, when I interact with folks, one of the things that we find is that, and I'll ask people about what memories do these evoke? And people will bring up, just thinking about this brings back this childhood memory that was really pleasant, or it brings back like a snow day, or it brings back, just the smell of, the chocolate and the cookies and so forth. What we're talking about here with savoring is bringing into existence a couple things. One is bringing in an experience of awe. And awe, in particular, is really enhanced by sensory awareness. And one of the cool things about satisfaction, being present focused, having a better sense of happiness is what we find that when people savor experiences, don't negate them, don't minimize them, but stop and smell the roses and introduce some sort of level of sensory awareness, they tend to feel better. They're much more resilient to stress. The things that I was worried about before are less problematic right now. if you think about it back to an experience where your sort of mind was blown in a positive way, what happened in that moment? How did you feel? Usually we feel pretty good. It's an exhilarating thing. Awe and sensory awareness are an important part of this. And these are practical things that we can do every day. While you're sitting there with your lunch, there are activities around mindful eating. How does it taste? What does it smell like? Okay, if you step outside, if you step outside and you feel the sun on your skin, how does that feel? Sensory awareness. Allow for feeling. And this goes back to the idea that sometimes we are taught that certain feelings are bad and they should be avoided. And not all feelings feel good. Not all emotions feel good. The reality is that all emotions have a purpose, and none of them are bad. But when we start thinking in terms of good and bad, or those cognitive errors that I mentioned start to play, they tend to make those feelings into something that they don't necessarily are. And interestingly, one of the things that we find is that as with children are much more experientially focused. They're much more into sensory-based learning, experiential learning, feeling-based learning. And as time goes on, as we become adults and so forth, we become less focused on those domains and more cognitively focused, which may help explain why sometimes we stray from like just being able to allow ourselves to feel. There's a concept of what's called emotion regulation, which is the ability to allow myself to feel whatever I feel without having to judge it, without having to respond to it. It's a hard thing to do because our brain is wired to try and fix things, especially things that feel unpleasant. But allowing ourselves to feel is really important. This is where a lot of the newer CBT models have gone, is allowing us to do this, in particular with mindfulness practices and meditation-based practices. And along those lines, what I would say is there's lots of ways to do mindfulness. Sensory-based awareness is one of those. Breathing exercises is one of those. Meditation, folks that do meditation on a consistent basis, usually what I find from them is that if they do it consistently day in, day out, somewhere around 20, 30, 35 days, they report something changes. They can't fully describe it, but there is a calm, there is a contentness, there's a general sense of peace that comes over them that lives with them more consistently than not. And again, all of these activities here are designed to try and move our physical sense, our physical state into a different place where we are less anxious, less in that fight or flight response, things of that nature. So savoring is one of these key principles. Lots of ways to do it, and it's based on sensory principles. Next time you bite into a cookie, stop and just slow down and experience what it's like. Finally, the idea of gratitude. There's a lot of research coming out that shows that gratitude by itself, or the practice of appreciation and gratitude, is something that is very powerful in helping us bring about perspective and balancing really intrusive, what we would think of as negative, unpleasant feeling states. In our Start Now program, which is a group-based program where we focus a lot on CBT principles as well as mindfulness and meditation, last week, literally in our group, we talked about gratitude. And one of the activities that I have folks do is I have them list at least one thing that they're grateful for as far as their history, their personal history, one thing that they're grateful for about their current context, even though it might be really hard, and then one thing that they're grateful for about themselves, their own person. And what I often find is that people struggle in the domain of giving themselves appreciation and gratitude for what it is about me that I like. And it helps identify and amplify and show us some of the patterns in thinking and that narrative that might be there. But gratitude helps us balance. When we do it, it's a choiceful thing. It helps us balance and soften how we feel. This next one is the idea of what we call mind the gap. This is a picture of the Royal Gorge, I believe, from Colorado, and I'm from Colorado. And if you've ever been there, it's a large suspension bridge that you can walk across, look down into the chasm. But the idea with mind the gap and using a bridge is the idea that we want to link consistently and pull together the gap between what we believe, what we value, and how we behave through our choices and actions. It goes back to this idea of what we call cognitive dissonance, and we've all experienced this in different times in our life. Maybe so, sort of like a push-pull effect, where you might feel pulled and stretched away from feeling really unsettled because something doesn't line up with how I thought it would go. Something I've done doesn't line up with something that I value. That's cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that's important is that if we know what our values are, if we know what our core beliefs are about, making purposeful, deliberate actions that align with that become important. As creatures, we do much better when the things that we do align with what we believe and say we're going to do. When that gap starts to get wider and wider, people become very unsettled, and that's really uncomfortable. But the idea here is that if you know what you're about, if you know what you value, make focused, deliberate actions in that direction, because we do better as actors than as reactors. And what we find is that when people have things that they look forward to, whether it's today, tomorrow, next week, next month, whether it's family, a trip, some sort of activity that gives me joy, what we find is that people are much more resilient to stress when they do that. And as part of this, going back to the idea of happiness as an only outcome pursuit, part of the caveat here is be mindful of outcome-only pursuits. Be open to the idea that things can change. But we want to realign how we believe with what we do along the way. But mind the gap. Be committed, purposeful. This next one is a principle of what we call purposeful and deliberate time making. There's an interesting concept that has come out of social, psychological, and learning cognitive research. And this is this idea of time affluence. And this has come out probably here in the last decade or so, more or less. And one of the predominant researchers in this domain is Cassie Holmes, who's out at UCLA, I believe. And she actually does some work with Laurie Santos, who has a podcast on happiness. And so this is one of these interesting, very interesting concepts that come up. And what we find is that time affluence is this idea of having enough time, sufficient time to accomplish what I want to accomplish. And there's a classic study that they looked at where basically if people have about 2 hours of downtime a day, they tend to feel pretty rushed and there's not enough time affluence. Yet at the same time, if people have 6 or more hours, give or take, of downtime, they start to get anxious and bored. And so the idea is that there is this ability or this idea that maybe there is a range of having time for myself for pleasurable focus activities, things that are good for me, the idea of being time rich. And what we find is that when people are rushed or feel rushed for time, the perception of time speeds up. What we also find is that people are less willing to be kind and helpful to others. We also find that mistakes and errors are more likely to happen. We say things or do things that we don't necessarily want to say as well on an interpersonal level. Okay, so there's like a classic study, it's what's called the Good Samaritan study, where basically they set up a scenario where basically you bring people in, you make them feel rushed, like, yep, you're behind, you got to get somewhere else. And you induce the sense of feeling just hurried and rushed. And then along the way, you set up a scenario where somebody needs help or directions or something beneficial to them. And what you find is that the people who are in a rush are less likely to stop and help. And so the idea with time affluence is looking for opportunities to make time. And what we find, interestingly, if we go back to the idea of the caveat that I mentioned about money and happiness, the one caveat where money can influence our overall perception of happiness is when money buys time. Money buys time. That's the one caveat. Because with time, it allows us to do other kinds of things. And with this, the question then becomes, how do we make time? And so there are very focused ways of being able to make time. This idea of having special time or time blocking, setting aside something that you do on purpose that is deliberate, whether it's something with family, I go to the gym, maybe I go to church, doing something that is meaningful to me where I block time and I make it happen, even if it sounds hard doing it, what we find is that people are much more satisfied on the back end of that. So blocking time is important. Okay. And the other interesting thing here is that I would say that not only stratifying, prioritizing your time, but learning something new and novel can be an example of doing something purposeful and deliberate with time making. One of the interesting things that we find over time, is that the perception of time tends to speed up as we get older, in part because we move away from experiential learning as a children to more cognitive operations later. And part of it has to do with the fact that things are not as novel or new as we get older. And the perception that time speeds up, you'll hear people say, wow, that year went by fast. Wow, today went by really quick. Wow, things seem to be speeding up as I get older. And one of the interesting things that we have found is that if people are willing to stop and learn something new, to be experientially focused, one of the things that can happen, or even using mindfulness, even brief mindfulness, breathing, sensory-based input, their perception of time slows down. And so one of the things we encourage is doing something that is deliberate, whether it's mindfulness based, learning something new, savoring, doing something that is different helps us slow things down and creates a new experience. Practical acts of kindness. Again, I go back to this. Practical acts of kindness are a good way of being able to create balance and perspective in our world. There's a classic exercise, what's called the time left exercise. And this is like if you knew the exact date of your death, what would you do with the time you have left? This is kind of similar to writing your own obituary, but a little bit different, which is to say, okay, if you knew that you only had X amount of years to live, what would you do with your time to make it purposeful and enjoyable? And this goes back to there is some limited research on what the biggest regrets that people have as they near their end of life. And a lot of those actually have to do with, one, some things we're talking about is having the courage to be consistent with myself, wishing I hadn't worked so hard. Oddly, we're all listening to this at work. Wishing that I had the courage to better express my feelings. It doesn't mean being a jerk, but it means being able to effectively express yourself and what you think. That goes back to minding the gap, being consistent. Wishing I had stayed in touch with those people who are closest to me, with my friends, family, and wishing that I had let myself be happier. And so this comes from a book from a hospice nurse in Australia. And so there are similar findings related to this. But the idea is that if you knew what you had left, how would you spend your time to make it more meaningful? And then finally, this idea of the opportunity principle. When you look at this picture here, there's different ways of seeing it. And in fact, there's more or less two ways of seeing this picture on the right. Some of you will immediately see an older woman. Some of you will see a younger woman. And this is one of those classic illusions that exist out there. And so you may be able to switch back and forth, or you might see one more than the other. And that's okay. But the idea here with the opportunity principle is being able to, one, become more aware of your own narrative and patterns. This is kind of where the older, and what I talked about as part of the CBT, know your patterns, know your narrative. If you know what your script is, if you know what your narrative is, it creates opportunity for doing something different. It doesn't mean you have to change everything. That's hard to do. But sometimes small things matter. Creating deliberate moments and areas of focus matter. They do make a difference in how we feel as far as being happy. This goes back to, are you open and willing to learn something new? How open are you to being present and open to opportunity? And one of the things that we find is that people who tend to be more anxious tend to be less open to learning things that are new. The stress tends to take us away from our willingness to be open. But if we make it happen, if we prioritize it, we're more likely to feel better. And the idea is sometimes there's this would be an interesting topic to talk about sometime as well, but there's a line of research that looks at the perception of luck. And what they find is that when you control for people's perception of how lucky or unlucky they are, what you tend to find is that openness to opportunity ultimately determines essentially how lucky people actually are. People who perceive themselves as lucky tend to be much more open to opportunities versus closed. And so the idea is, if you know your narrative, if you know your pattern, what can you do to be more open to opportunities that may challenge or compete or modify that pattern? And the other part of this is accept what is real and focus on what provides meaning and value. Part of this is staying away from hypotheticals, over wishfulness, that leads to helplessness, and being able to focus on what provides meaning and value. And am I willing to do the things, to take a step, do a thing? One of the folks in my group basically refers to it as wiggle your big toe, do one thing, do a thing, start somewhere. One of the things that I often hear is that people will say, well, where do I start? How do I get the motivation? Be careful of motivation becoming a block. Sometimes it's about making an active, overt step, regardless of how motivated or not motivated I am. It's doing a thing. And what we find is that once people get started, they generally do pretty well. All right, so I will stop there. All of these are intended to provide maybe some very general, but also some practical kinds of things that people can do in your day-to-day world. And I've included these additional resources. These are some of the podcasts that exist out there that are generally pretty good. The Happiness Lab, especially with Dr. Laurie Santos, I think that one's awesome. The Happier Hour book, The Good Life, The How of Happiness, the Happiness Trap that I referenced. These are good general books to review as well, if you're interested in some materials. And so I will go ahead and stop sharing and stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Geik. That was so informative and very thought-provoking. I'm reminded that I kind of feel like I want to go home and bake cookies and plan a trip. So I hope that some of you all were inspired as well. I do see one question in the chat, and it says, do you have some resources for being open to opportunity for neurodivergence?
There are resources. I can definitely send you some. What would be a good way to be able to send some of those resources, I guess?
If you could send those to me, Dr. Geik, I will be emailing this entire group and sending some resources to them. So I'll be happy to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions. I just see lots of appreciative thoughts, and people really loved this presentation. And I want to remind everybody here that I will be sending you an email next week that has your Personify Health voucher points, as well as I mentioned additional resources and information about upcoming events that Wellness at Work is sponsoring. And I also included in the chat a link to the Greater Good Science Center out of University of California at Berkeley. I know Dr. Geik mentioned meditation and mindfulness, and there are some great practices there that I would encourage you to go and check out. So yeah, just lots of thanks. This is so helpful. Dr. Geik, thank you so much. I'm just so grateful that you spent this time with us today, and we really appreciate it. Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.